The idea was already settled before the fighting began. A tank looked safe. Thick steel, few openings, a machine built to absorb danger. From the outside, it seemed obvious that the men inside were protected, safer than anyone moving on foot. That belief spread easily. Armor was visible, crews were not. What couldn't be seen was assumed to be secure. Inside the tank, the crews understood something else. They knew the steel was not a shield, only a boundary. It stopped some threats and turned others inward. Heat gathered, noise pressed in, space disappeared the moment something went wrong. The armor did not remove danger, it confined it. And when failure came, it came quietly, leaving the crew with less air, less time, and no room to escape. Tanks changed warfare the moment they rolled onto the battlefield. Steel on tracks, cannons mounted front and center, engines loud enough to rattle the ground. They looked unstoppable. Armies that had them felt powerful. Armies that did not felt exposed. But there was something about tanks that created a dangerous illusion, one that spread faster than the machines themselves. People watching from a distance saw moving fortresses, thick armor plates, sloped designs meant to deflect shells, turrets that could rotate and fire in any direction. Everything about a tank screamed protection. Soldiers outside the armor saw crews climbing into hatches and assumed those men were safer than infantry in trenches. Safer than anyone else on the battlefield, really. That assumption made sense if you never got close enough to see what happened inside. The crews knew better. They didn't climb into tanks thinking they were invincible. They climbed in knowing the armor was there, but also knowing it wasn't a guarantee. Steel stops some things. It doesn't stop everything. The difference between what it stops and what it doesn't became clear the first time a shell hit close enough to matter. Crews learned quickly that the tank wasn't a bunker. It was a compartment, sealed tight, filled with ammunition, fuel, and people who couldn't leave fast. Armor gave them a chance. That's what most crews would tell you if you asked. A chance to fight, a chance to move, a chance to survive if things went a certain way. But chances aren't certainties. The problem was that everyone else treated armor like it was absolute. Commanders sent tanks forward expecting breakthroughs. Propaganda showed them as symbols of dominance. The public believed crews were shielded from the worst of combat. None of that was true, but the belief stuck. What made it worse was that tanks hid their weaknesses well. From the outside, you couldn't see the cramped interior, the heat building up inside, or the way sound became deafening once the engine started. You couldn't see how tight the space was, how little room there was to move if something went wrong. The armor looked solid because it was solid, but solid doesn't mean safe. Crews understood that distinction. The rest of the world didn't, and that gap in understanding shaped how tank warfare was fought, how crews were trained, and how many of them came home. The myth wasn't harmless. It made people careless with lives that deserved more thought. Inside those steel shells, the men who actually had to fight knew exactly how fragile their protection really was. Crews didn't talk about armor thickness the way engineers did. They didn't measure safety in millimeters of steel or angles of deflection. Those numbers mattered to the people designing tanks, but inside the crew compartment, safety came down to something simpler. Could you get out if things went bad? That was the question that stuck in their minds every time they climbed through the hatch. Some crews made it through entire battles without taking a hit. Others got hit on their first day and walked away with nothing worse than ringing ears and adrenaline that wouldn't settle for hours. A few got hit and didn't walk away at all. There wasn't a pattern you could rely on. Experience helped, but it didn't make you bulletproof. Luck played a bigger role than anyone wanted to admit, and it doesn't care how well trained you are. When a tank took a hit and survived, people called it a success. The tank rolled back to base, crews patched it up, and it went out again. But surviving as a machine and surviving as a crew were two different things. A tank could take a shell, stay operational, and still leave its crew dead or dying inside. That happened more often than most records show. Casualty reports tracked destroyed vehicles, not wounded men still sitting in functional ones. Injuries inside tanks did not always come from penetration. Sometimes a shell hit the armor and did not go through, but the impact was enough to send crew members slamming into metal surfaces. Concussions were common. Broken bones happened when hits threw people against equipment or hatches. Burns came from fires that started in the engine or in ammunition storage, even when the tank itself stayed intact. Crews could survive the hit and still end up in a field hospital, or worse, trapped inside with injuries that made movement impossible. The real danger started after the first hit. That's when crews had to make a choice: stay inside and hope the tank holds, or bail out and risk getting shot in the open. Both options came with their own kind of fear. Staying meant trusting steel that had already been tested once. Leaving meant exposing yourself to machine gun fire, artillery, or enemy infantry who knew a crew on foot was an easy target. Either way, the decision had to be made in seconds, and there was no way to know which choice was right until it was too late to change your mind. What no one prepared them for was how fast everything happened. Penetration did not always mean the tank exploded. That is what most people expected, but it was not how things usually went. A shell could punch through armor, and the tank would keep running. The crew inside, though, faced something worse than fire. When steel fails, it does not just crack. It fractures, and those fractures send pieces of metal flying inward at speeds fast enough to kill. Spalling was the term crews learned to fear. It happened when a shell hit the armor hard enough to break chunks off the interior surface without fully penetrating. The outer armor held, but the inner layer shattered. Shards of steel, some the size of a fist, some smaller and faster, ricocheted through the crew compartment. They did not need to be large to be deadly. A piece of metal moving that fast could tear through a body as easily as a bullet. Crews did not always see it coming. 1 second they were fine. The next, someone was bleeding, and no one knew where the hit came from. Some tanks used spall liners, fabric or thin plating designed to catch those fragments before they reached the crew. It helped, but it was not standard everywhere. And even when it was there, it did not catch everything. Crews in tanks without liners knew they were more exposed, but they climbed in anyway because the alternative was not fighting at all. That was not a choice most of them felt they had. Fire was another consequence of penetration, and it spread faster than people realized. Tanks carried fuel, ammunition, hydraulic fluid, and oil. All of it burned. A shell that made it through the armor often ignited one of those materials, and once fire started inside a sealed compartment, it did not stop. Oxygen was consumed in seconds. Smoke filled the space so fast that crews could not see the hatches, even if they were only a few feet away. Some crews made it out. Others did not get the chance. The fumes were just as dangerous as the flames. Burning fuel produced carbon monoxide. Ammunition gave off toxic smoke when it cooked off. Crews breathing that air did not just choke. They lost consciousness, sometimes before they even realized they were in danger. Tanks found later with dead crews inside often showed no signs of catastrophic damage. The armor held. The fire killed them anyway. Even tanks that were not destroyed outright could become death traps in ways no one outside could see. The inside of a tank was not built for comfort. Space was tight, surfaces were metal, and ventilation was minimal. Under normal conditions, that made things uncomfortable. Under combat conditions, it became life-threatening. Heat built up fast once the engine started running. In summer months, temperatures inside could hit 110 to 140 degrees. Crews sweated through their uniforms within minutes. Dehydration set in quickly, but there was no time to stop and drink water when you were under fire. When a fire started, that heat became unbearable. Flames consumed oxygen faster than the ventilation system could replace it. Crews did not just feel the heat. They felt their lungs struggling to pull in air that was not there anymore. Breathing became harder with every second. Panic did not come from fear of dying. It came from the body's desperate need for oxygen and the realization that there was not any left. Smoke made everything worse. It did not just block vision, it disoriented people. Crews trained to operate in the dark, but smoke was different. It moved, it thickened, and it filled every corner of the compartment. Gunners lost sight of their targets. Drivers could not see the controls in front of them. Loaders fumbled with ammunition they should have been able to load by touch alone. The smoke did not just slow them down, it made them vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with enemy fire. Panic was always close. Training helped crews manage it, but training had limits. Instructors could simulate noise, heat, and confined spaces, but they could not replicate the feeling of being trapped, with fire spreading and no clear way out. Real combat introduced variables that no amount of preparation could fully cover. Crews who stayed calm had better chances of survival, but staying calm required ignoring every instinct screaming at them to move, to breathe, to get out. Some crews developed routines to fight panic. They memorized the number of steps from their position to the nearest hatch. They practiced moving through the compartment with their eyes closed so they could navigate by feel if smoke made vision impossible. They drilled on emergency procedures until the movements became automatic. All of that helped, but it did not eliminate fear. It just gave them something to focus on besides the fear itself. The difference between survival and death often came down to seconds where decisions had to be made without hesitation. Not all tank crews were trained the same way. Some armies invested heavily in crew preparation, running exercises that simulated combat conditions as closely as possible. Others focused more on teaching crews how to operate the machinery and left survival skills as an afterthought. The difference showed up the first time those crews came under fire. Experience could not be taught, but preparation could, and crews that had it lasted longer. The armies that prioritized bailout drills gave their crews a real advantage. These drills taught crews how to evacuate a burning tank in under 10 seconds. 10 seconds sounds like plenty of time until you are doing it in full gear, in the dark, with smoke filling your lungs and your hands shaking from adrenaline. Crews that practiced it over and over again built the muscle memory they needed. When the moment came, they did not think, they moved. Other armies skipped that training. They assumed crews would figure it out under pressure, or they did not think it mattered enough to dedicate training time to it. Those crews paid for that gap in knowledge. When something went wrong, they hesitated. They looked for exits they should have already known by heart. They wasted seconds trying to remember procedures they had only been taught once. In a tank fire, those seconds were the difference between getting out and not getting out at all. Experienced crews developed instincts that new crews did not have. They could tell the difference between a shell that bounced off and one that penetrated just by the sound it made. They knew when the engine was about to fail, based on subtle changes in how it sounded or how the tank handled. They recognized the smell of burning hydraulic fluid before smoke became visible. All of that came from time spent inside the tank, and there was no shortcut to gaining it. New crews made mistakes that veterans had already learned to avoid. They stacked ammunition in places that seemed convenient but blocked escape routes. They did not secure equipment properly, so when the tank took a hit, loose gear became projectiles. They panicked when the radio went dead, instead of switching to backup communication methods. None of these mistakes were fatal on their own, but combined with combat stress and enemy fire, they added up fast. Skill mattered, but it could not remove fear entirely. Tank crews knew the odds before they ever climbed into a tank. They did not need statistics to tell them their job was dangerous. They saw it in the faces of veterans who had already been through combat. They heard it in the way officers talked about armor tactics, always framing things in terms of acceptable losses rather than guaranteed survival. The expectation was not that everyone would make it. The expectation was that enough would make it to complete the mission. Some crews wrote letters before going into battle. Not all of them, and not every time, but enough that it became a quiet ritual in certain units. These were not dramatic farewell letters. Most were practical. Instructions for family members, messages to friends, small personal details. They wanted someone to know if they did not come back. A lot of those letters never got mailed because the crews survived and decided there was no point in sending them. Others were found later in personal effects and delivered to families who never expected to receive them. Humor became a coping mechanism. Dark humor, the kind that does not make sense to anyone who has not been in the same situation. Crews joked about getting hit, about fires, about the smell inside the tank after a long day. The jokes were not funny in the traditional sense. They were a way to acknowledge fear without letting it take over. Talking about death directly felt too heavy, but joking about it made it something they could control, at least in conversation. What stands out in written accounts from tank crews is how calm some of them sound. They described combat in matter-of-fact language, laying out what happened without much emotional color. A shell hit. Someone got injured. They kept moving. The calmness was not because they did not feel anything. It was because putting feelings into words made those feelings harder to manage. Keeping things factual, clinical even, gave them distance from experiences that would have been overwhelming otherwise. The expectation of death shaped how crews behaved. Some became reckless, figuring that if death was likely anyway, there was no point in being cautious. Others became hyper-focused on survival, obsessing over every detail that might give them an edge. Most fell somewhere in between, accepting the risk but not letting it paralyze them. They did their jobs because the job needed doing, and thinking too much about what could happen made it harder to function. Fear was not weakness in that context. It was constant. Steel protected bodies, but morale protected decisions. A crew with high morale stayed together when things went wrong. They communicated clearly, followed orders without hesitation, and trusted each other enough to take risks when necessary. A crew with low morale fell apart under the same conditions. They second-guessed commands, hesitated when action was needed, and sometimes abandoned their tank even when staying inside was the safer option. The difference wasn't equipment or training. It was whether they believed in what they were doing and trusted the people beside them. Morale came from multiple sources. Leadership mattered. A commander who kept calm under fire and made smart decisions earned respect. A commander who panicked or made reckless choices destroyed confidence fast. Crews didn't need their commander to be perfect, but they needed to believe he wouldn't get them killed for no reason. That belief was fragile. It took time to build and could shatter in a single bad decision. trust between crew members was just as critical. The loader had to trust the gunner was aiming at the right target. The driver had to trust the commander's directions even when he couldn't see what was ahead. The gunner had to trust the loader would keep ammunition coming without being told. When that trust existed, the crew functioned as a single unit. When it didn't, every action required confirmation, every decision took longer, and combat became chaotic instead of coordinated. Units that kept crews together built stronger morale than units that constantly rotated personnel. Spending months training and operating with the same people created bonds that couldn't be replicated quickly. Crews knew each other's habits, strengths, and weaknesses. They developed shorthand communication that made coordination faster. They looked out for each other in ways that went beyond duty. When one crew member got injured, the others felt it personally. That personal investment made them fight harder to keep everyone alive. Low morale showed up in different ways. Some crews became fatalistic, going through the motions without believing they'd survive anyway. Others became openly defiant, questioning orders or refusing to take necessary risks. The worst cases involved crews abandoning their tanks at the first sign of trouble, leaving functional vehicles behind because they'd lost the will to keep fighting. When morale collapsed completely, steel stopped mattering. The armor was still there, but the will to use it wasn't. Many tank crews survived hits and climbed into another tank days or weeks later. Some did it immediately, getting into a replacement vehicle while their original one was still smoking on the battlefield. This was not universal, but it happened often enough to be notable. The question was not whether they could refuse. In most armies, they could not. The question was why they went back without being forced, why they chose to face the same danger again when they had already seen what it could do. Duty played a role, but not in the abstract sense people usually mean when they talk about military service. This was duty in a more immediate form. Their unit needed them. Their friends were still fighting. Walking away meant leaving those people to face the danger without them. And for many crews, that felt worse than the fear of getting hit again. It was not about patriotism or ideology. It was about not abandoning the people who had stood beside them. Loyalty to the crew mattered more than loyalty to the cause. Tank crews spent so much time together that they became something closer than friends. They ate together, slept near each other, and shared fears they would not talk about with anyone else. That bond created obligations that felt more real than orders from distant commanders. If the rest of the crew was going back out, leaving them felt like betrayal. Not betrayal of the army or the mission, but betrayal of the people who had kept you alive the last time. Some crews went back because staying behind felt impossible. Survivor's guilt set in fast when friends died, and you did not. The guilt did not make logical sense. Surviving was not something to feel bad about, but logic did not control how people processed trauma. Crews that lost members felt like they should have done something differently, even when there was nothing they could have done. Going back into combat gave them a way to feel useful again, to prove they were not just lucky, to honor the people who did not make it by continuing the fight. Others returned because they did not know what else to do. Their identity was tied to being a tank crew member. That was their skill, their role, the thing they had trained for and gotten good at. Walking away meant figuring out who they were without that identity, and in the middle of a war, there was not time or space to do that kind of rebuilding. This was human attachment shaping warfare. Statistics told one kind of story. They counted destroyed tanks, dead crew members, missions failed or accomplished. Those numbers were important for understanding the scale of armored warfare, but they missed most of what actually happened to the people inside the tanks. Numbers do not capture burns that healed but left scars across half a body. They do not measure lung damage from smoke inhalation that made breathing difficult for the rest of someone's life. They definitely do not account for trauma that followed survivors long after the fighting stopped. Burns were common among tank crews who survived fires. The burns were not always severe enough to kill, but they were severe enough to cause permanent damage. Skin grafts helped, but did not restore full function or appearance. Some crew members spent months in hospitals recovering from burns that covered significant portions of their bodies. The pain did not end when the wounds healed. Scar tissue limited movement made certain actions painful and served as a constant physical reminder of what had happened inside that tank. Lung damage often showed up later. Crews who breathed smoke, toxic fumes, or the byproducts of burning ammunition did not always feel the effects immediately. They coughed for a while, their throats hurt, and then they seemed to recover. Years later, respiratory problems developed. Chronic coughing, reduced lung capacity, increased susceptibility to infections. Doctors could trace it back to combat exposure, but by then, the damage was permanent. The crews had survived the war, but carried pieces of it in their bodies for decades afterward. Many veterans avoided enclosed spaces for the rest of their lives. Elevators, small rooms, cars with the windows up, anything that reminded them of being trapped in a metal box triggered panic. They knew intellectually that an elevator was not a tank, that the danger was not real, but knowing did not stop the physical response. Their bodies remembered what their minds tried to forget. Some learned to manage it over time. Others never fully adapted and structured their lives to avoid triggers as much as possible. Survival did not always mean escape. Some crew members made it out of burning tanks but with injuries that left them disabled. They survived in the technical sense. They were alive, but their quality of life was permanently reduced. The myth of invincibility made those costs easier to ignore. Tanks look powerful because they hide what is inside. The armor is visible. The gun is visible. The movement, the noise, the presence on the battlefield, all of that creates an impression of strength that is hard to shake. From any distance greater than a few feet, you cannot see the crew. You cannot see the cramped conditions, the heat, the fear. The tank's exterior projects invincibility, while the interior tells a completely different story. That gap between appearance and reality shaped how people thought about armored warfare. Generals planned tactics based on what tanks could theoretically accomplish. Propaganda used them as symbols of military might. The public saw them as evidence that their side had technological superiority. All of those perceptions were built on what the tank looked like from outside, not on what it felt like to be inside one when shells started landing. Crews were never invincible. They were exposed in ways that were not visible to observers. Exposed to heat that could disable them before fire even started. Exposed to toxic fumes that filled the compartment faster than anyone could react. Exposed to spalling that turned their own armor into a weapon against them. Exposed to mechanical failures that left them sitting targets. The armor protected them from some threats, but created others, and the balance was not as favorable as most people assumed. Stress was another invisible factor. Crews operated under constant psychological pressure that did not show up in after-action reports. The knowledge that they could be hit at any moment, that fire could start with no warning, that they might have seconds to escape if things went wrong. That pressure accumulated over time. It affected decision-making, reaction speed, and the ability to function effectively. Some crews managed it better than others, but no one was immune to it. The real strength of tank crews was not armor, it was endurance. The ability to keep functioning despite fear, despite exhaustion, despite seeing friends die, despite knowing their chances of long-term survival were not great. That endurance came from training, from loyalty to each other, from a sense of duty that went beyond following orders. Understanding this changes how we see armored warfare. Steel never made tank crews fearless. It only gave them a place to face fear together. The truth only becomes clear when the fighting drags on. Tanks did not make crews untouchable. They asked them to accept risk in a different form. Survival depended less on steel and more on judgment, trust, and how calmly a person could act when escape was uncertain. Armor could delay danger, but it could not remove it. In the end, what decided a crew's fate was never the machine alone, but how human limits held up inside it.